Imperial Lounge presents a night called
Reggae Dancehall by the Beach. To be held at Imperial Lounge, 2 to 14 High Street, Margate Seafront, Kent, CT9 180. To be held on the first Saturday of each month. Your host DJ Matt. Also rotated DJs, Roddy Boone, DJ Happy,
and Younger General.
Doors open 8 p.m. till late. Free entry all night. Music policy, reggae, dancehall, and a touch of soul. On the first Saturday of each month. Reggae Dancehall by the Beach. At the Imperial Lounge Margate. Do remember, you can also get VIP and Shisha booking. More info on the World Jam Global website. That's www.worldjamglobal.com. Also www.imperialloungemargate.co.uk.
See you there.
It's the right thing you doing. Rebellious like Malcolm. 1, 2, 3, swing it.
Do you have an old sound tape or your favorite cassette tape that you want converted to CD or MP3 format? Do you need a demo CD, radio ad, a DJ, or even a sound system for your wedding, birthday, or special occasion? Then why not get in contact with KTR Records on 07931 152 448 or check out our website on www.ktrrecords.com. We have been in business since 2004 and also undertake community projects. So for your remixes, doublets and all your sound editing needs, why not contact KTR Records, official sponsor of World Jam Global Radio. KTR Records, coming your way.
Sunday, May 27, 2018, GDS Entertainment proudly presents
Grooving on the Hudson.
That's right, Grooving on the Hudson Memorial Weekend Celebration. Music played by Road International, Selector Oxtail alongside King Shiloh International. All aboard the elegant Paddle Wheel Queens, One World's Fair Marina. Boarding 6 p.m. sharp from Flushing, Queens, certified Shea Stadium. And Miss Marina will be selling 7 p.m. sharp. Also,
For tickets, People's Choice Furniture, Bronx, New York. Doris Restaurant, Queens, New York. G's Restaurant, Queens, New York.
Also,
WorldJamGlobal.com.
Also, complimentary dinner prize and surprises.
Come party with us.
Let's take it slow. Sailing on the summer breeze.
World Jam Global Radio, this is Clarity.
Well, I want to say a big good night going out to each and every single one of you right across the globe.
Already did my time.
Once again, it's your host, Kervin, Julien, on World Jam Global Radio for another edition of Issues Today.
Time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Back in the day, I didn't really care about the system. It was all about survival. It was do or die. I had too many rivals. I was too young and foolish to stay in school. I learned my lessons in the street. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about beating no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly.
So today on today's show,
On supply.
I got special guest Satish Sekhar,
That's why I'm telling my story to you and you.
author,
I had to repent, I must admit. I was doing all kind of stupid shit.
I got Kerry Jackson,
Sit back and think it over since
BBC Wales,
if I used to live, I wouldn't do it.
journalist and reporter.
Done, my brain was so numb, I was a real Forrest Gump, but I was nobody's chum. Me and Billy the Kid had a lot in common.
Don't forget, we're going live right across the world right now.
Schwarzenegger, I'd chew you up and spit you out like a real alligator, especially all you haters.
The opening statements are going on right now. He could be facing life in prison.
Already did my time, paid for my crime. Already did my time. Already did my time, paid for my crime. Already did my time. Pay for my crime, pay for my crime, pay for my crime, pay for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. I'm trying to get this felony off my back so I can get my life on track and have the right to vote and live like an ordinary citizen again. This is my message to all of my friends in the pen, statewide, worldwide. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do. That's why I'm telling my story to you and you. I had to repent, I must admit, I was doing all kind of stupid shit. Now sit back and think it over since I've gotten older. The life I used to live, I wouldn't do it again. I was young and dumb, my brain was so numb. I was a real Forrest Gump, but I was nobody's chump. Me and Billy the Kid had a lot in common. I was the real Terminator, much meaner than Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Oh, think about, just about got that.
Like a real alligator, especially all you haters. Already did my time, paid for my crime. Already did my
Yeah, so wherever you are right across the world,
time. I paid for
we are going out on multi-platforms.
did my time.
The opening statements are going on right
We're looking at the case of the Cardiff 3, death in the community, 30 years on. And today my special guest will be Satish Sekar, dear friend.
Trying to cope with this living hell.
And also Kerry Jackson, BBC Wales,
Trying to
journalist and reporter.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
You can get us live on www.worldjamglobalradio.com. Find us on Issues Today, Facebook Live, and all social media platforms.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Our Father who art in heaven, how will it be?
That's right, we are now live.
Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Maybe you're enjoying the new studio look.
And forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us.
Feeling the love, friends, feeling the love.
Temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine
First of all, I want to give a big shout out to all of you who are following us, no matter where you are.
Amen.
London, UK, stateside America.
All those drive-by killings, stop them. It ain't about nothing.
Please share.
Who was out
Share this post to all your friends and all the groups that you're involved with.
I'm trying to get this felony off my back so I can get my life on track and have the right to vote and live like an ordinary citizen again. This is my message to all of my friends in the pen, statewide, worldwide. And put down those knives, stop stabbing each other. Yeah.
Very shortly, I'm going to be handing you over to my guests who will take their time to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about themselves before we get into the nitty-gritty. Stand by for a lively debate. And first and foremost, I do believe he's landed. He's actually in his hotel, and I'll leave him to tell you exactly where he is right now. But it's my dear guest, my dear friend, Mr. Satish Sekar. Are you there, Satish?
Yes, I'm here in Fez, Morocco. Just landed and got to the hotel literally 5 minutes ago.
Wow, well, that was a very, very close shave indeed. I did try to keep it running for as long as I could, just to make sure that you can get there. Maybe you could do this the honor of just sharing with our audience who you are, where you are, and what you're about, Satish.
Okay, I'm a journalist and author. I've recently published, or through the Fitted In Project, published a third book, largely on the Lynette White inquiry case. And I must correct you, as you knew I would, Kervin, it's Cardiff 5, not Cardiff 3. There were 5 of them who were wrongly accused, and all 5 of them are innocent, and therefore we should be calling them the Cardiff 5. I am here in Fez, the historic city in Morocco, which is the last resting place of the last Muslim king of Spain, or rather actually Granada, Mohammed XII, who was deposed in 1492 and eventually fled to Morocco and died here in Fez in 1533, I believe. What I'm about is writing these books and trying to raise consciousness about these issues which have too long gone unnoticed. For instance, the 4th book I will be publishing this year is about a tariff situation which is completely and utterly outrageous, in that the real murderer, Jeffrey Gafford, received a significantly lower tariff than 2 of the Cardiff 3 for the same crime. And I say Cardiff 3 because the Cardiff 3 were the ones who were convicted. John and Ronnie Actie were not, but they are both innocent. So the issue here is, how was it allowed for the real murderer to be rewarded for committing the crime effectively, and the innocent people were basically punished for being innocent?
Okay, well, that's we're going to get into that, and hopefully everybody's going to get a better understanding of what this case entails. And so I'd like to introduce my next guest, who will also be speaking on the subject, and she is Kerry Jackson, BBC Wales journalist and reporter. Good evening, or good afternoon. Well, you are in the UK, so it's a good evening to you, Kerry.
Yeah, good evening, Kevin. How are you doing?
We're fine, thank you very much. Do you mind just telling the audience just a little bit about you and maybe why you got involved in the in this particular Cardiff 5 case, as Satish reminds us?
Indeed, no problem. Well, I'm afraid I can't claim to be anywhere half as exotic as Satish over there in Morocco. I'm here in the city of Cardiff, capital of Wales, which is where I'm based for the BBC. I work as a feature writer for the BBC News website based in Cardiff, and my speciality, if you can call it that, is writing very in-depth accounts of the stories behind the headlines, delving that little bit deeper into the lives of the people who in fact make those news headlines. In fact, the team I work with, which is now called Wales Investigates, was one of the first to make a television programme about tonight's subject. And that was a programme that was broadcast way back in 1991. But coming back to the present a little bit more, it was towards the end of last year that we were discussing the fact that it would soon be the 30th anniversary of the murder of a young woman called Lynette White. And I was asked to write a piece to coincide with that anniversary, which fell on the 14th of February this year. And most people of a certain age in South Wales are familiar with the case. But the problem is that the case has endured for so long, for 30 years, as we're saying, and there's been so many gaps of many years between various court cases and legal actions. And as a result, the story had become fragmented, and perhaps the true impact of what happened had been lost to some extent. But this, if you like, was the first opportunity in 3 decades when there was no legal action pending. The entire story could be told in full. And I started on some pretty extensive research into the case, and what became very clear to me very quickly was just how dramatic it really was. I'm born and bred in Cardiff. I'm the same age as Lynette would have been had her life not been so cruelly ended. And it was hard for me to get my head around the fact that all this had happened in my city, my hometown. I mean, the events, it has the ingredients for a major Hollywood movie in many ways. It's invariably been described as one of the UK's most notorious miscarriages of justice. And we hear about cases like this time and again in the news. They're reported extensively. But what I found during my career as a reporter is that the basic facts that are in the bulletins, or even in a half-hour documentary programme, they only really scratch the surface and they don't really get to the heart of what has happened. And what interests me, and I think a lot of other people, is in fact the lives of the people that are involved, the characters, and what happens to their lives when something terrible like this happens, and the extent to which lives are ruined, how the stigma of being accused of something never really goes away, the impact that has not just on the innocent men in this case, but their families, friends, and the entire community in which they live. And this is an area of journalism that's always interested me, is what is exactly happening behind the headlines. And I think in this case, the scenario can only be described as something of a nightmare, really. If you put yourselves in the position that these guys were put in, it's horrifying. So what I set out to do is tell these stories in the hope that they will connect more with an audience on a very emotional level, and perhaps make them stop and think for just 1 minute. How would I feel if this happened to me? How would it feel if it was my brother, my father, my uncle? And the reaction to the piece was for many people, even people that thought they were familiar with the case, to say that they hadn't a clue the extent of what had happened. And for me, it was also important to reach a new generation, a young internet generation. They were very unlikely to have even heard of this case. So in February this year, as I said, the piece was published on the BBC News website. It was published on the Global front page. And it was a long, very detailed piece. I think it was something around 8,000 words. It was 6 chapters. It had, sort of chapter and verse of what happened, like a small book, if you like. But I found the most challenging part of writing this was what I had to leave out in order to just get to those 8,000 words. In the end, there were so many really important parts of the story that I had to gloss over, areas of interest that could have perhaps been 1,000 or 2,000 words. I just had to boil down to a couple of paragraphs. So it kind of left me with a feeling that there was much more to be done on this story. And so that's my plan at the moment, which is why I reached out to you, Kervin. And hopefully we can bring in many more of the elements in this truly shocking story, almost incredible story that's blighted the lives of so many people.
The funny thing is, when Satish asked me to put together some form of a structure for us to go through today's show, I said to you guys, I was going to take it away, think about it. I had it in my mind. But as I started to list it, I realized I could actually have gone on forever if I wanted to, because there was just so much intriguing information or situations that took place throughout the 30 years that this has been outstanding, that there are so many elements that have only been touched as the tip of an iceberg on every occasion that it's been reported on, that unless you was to get inside Satish Sekhar's head, which, let me tell you, what a wealth of information on this case he has. And I know this because I spent a lot of time with Satish right at the very beginning, even just especially prior to the appeal, when we started to go through all the information and the evidence that had been hidden when Satish started to unravel it all in time for the appeal. So I think this is a very interesting topic to take on. And I think it's going to be very controversial, some of the elements that we discuss. And I think some people are going to be shocked as to how this has been 30 years outstanding, and we're still no nearer to getting a real justice. Because let me just, I suppose we can say this in the summing up, but the real injustice has not been that the wrong people were convicted. For me, the real injustice was the people that got them convicted have been allowed to get away with it. And I think that's the real sense of injustice for me, is that the people that blatantly set up individuals for this have been allowed to get away with it somehow. But I'm not going to go into too much, and I'm not going to try and unpeel the onion before we get there. So in looking at the platform and the structure, maybe either yourself, Kerry, or Satish, I don't know which one of you wants to go first, but let us just lay out the murder scene so that the audience can get an idea of what we're talking about.
Okay, no problem. Satish, do you want me to take this?
Yeah, you can take that one.
Okay, so as I mentioned previously, this happened 30 years ago, back in the year 1988, and it was Sunday, the 14th of February, in a place called Butetown, which is an area of Cardiff, in Cardiff's once world-famous Docklands, but at the time it was pretty desolate, down on its luck. So basically, a young woman walks into Butetown police station, and she goes up to the duty sergeant, and she explains that she's lent the keys to her flat to a friend of hers, a friend she hasn't seen for a couple of days. She's just been round to the flat. She can't gain access. The door's locked, which is unusual in itself. She explains that she's really worried about her friend now. So the two police officers come back to the flat with her. It's in complete dark. It's above a betting shop. There's a betting shop, and there's three-story building. And this is the flat directly above the betting shop on the first floor. There's no electricity. They go through the communal door up the stairs. They try their door to flat 1, and it is indeed locked. Basically, one of the police officers kind of aims a very forceful kick at the door, and it springs open. There in the landing, there's litter strewn on the floor. There's 3 doors which are all shut. He goes into one. The kitchen leads into the bathroom. Nothing untoward in there. He goes into another room. It's empty except for 2 mattresses that are propped up against the wall. And then they flick their torchlight to the 3rd door, and they notice that there are bloodstains on it. So they open the door to the 3rd room, and there's no light. There's the orange glow of a street lamp outside, and there is a bed, a van, and there is a body at the end of that bed. It becomes very clear, even in the very poor light, that the body is being subject to a very vicious attack. Basically, that was the remains of Lynette White, as I mentioned before, a 20-year-old Cardiff girl. Basically, it's one of the most brutal murders that you could possibly imagine. Most murders are brutal, but this was particularly nasty in nature. She had a very savage cut to her throat. Her wrists had been slit. There were several defense wounds on her arms, where she'd obviously put up a fight. And all told, there was in excess of 50 stab and slash wounds to her body. Basically, this was the start of a police investigation. The murder itself was controversial, and the shockwaves around the city, everybody knew about this. And so basically, this was controversial in itself, but nothing that was to come in the aftermath of all this.
Satish, that's a pretty open statement as to the effects, the murder itself, the crime scene, so to speak. But once the scene had been discovered, I would imagine that a police operation was quickly put into place, right?
Yeah. Yes, it was. It was a few hours, or several hours after the actual murder, that they found Lynette's body, and then obviously began a murder investigation. And while we have to say it was one of the worst investigations of all time in terms of how badly it went wrong, the one thing they did do right was store the scientific samples. Well, before they were scientifically tested, they stored a number of samples, and those were, in fact, the samples that helped to prove the Cardiff Five were completely innocent.
Let me just stop you there, Satish. Before we go into the evidence, I really wanted to talk about the police hunt, because now you've got a girl that's been murdered. The alarm has been raised. People are aware that this is a murder scene now. What was it that the police did? What happened next?
Do you want me to answer this, Steve?
Well, as I said, there was a pathologist, sorry?
Well, no, because I suppose I didn't want to put words into your mouth, but I wanted, because we're going to go into the evidence as it is and how it was attributed.
Yes, I know, but you see, part of the evidence issue that I'm raising here is what they did and how things went completely wrong.
I think before that, if I can just come in there.
After it made it impossible, that's the point. Sure.
Basically, what happened was this was, as I said, this was headline news around Cardiff. This was a deeply shocking murder. Within a few weeks, the police had launched we remember the show Crime Watch. It's not on anymore. It just finished. But this was the first show that Crime Watch, and there was a big feature of this murder on there. So basically, there was an individual that had been spotted by a member of the public, and he had been seen crouched in the doorway of 7 James Street, which was the address in which Lynette was murdered. And he had blood, he had a big cut to his arm, he was crying, he was mumbling, he was incoherent, he was in a bad way. And so this was the prime suspect. And the police, this was a compelling, very early lead on this case.
In fact, sorry, just to interject there, Kerry, to the point where John Stalker, the head of CID at the time, went on Crime Watch on national TV and said that this was the man that they were looking for, the murderer of Lynette White, right?
Absolutely, yeah. They said, this is our prime suspect. We need to find this guy. We believe that, he has the blood of Lynette on him. They gave a big description.
It wasn't Stalker that said that.
It was John Williams. It was the head of the South Wales CID at the time. Okay. Yeah. They said this categorically is the guy that we're looking for. There was a photo fit, which was very distinctive. They actually described this guy as looking very distinctive. They gave a description. He was kind of like it was 20 to 30, certain height. He had dark hair. He was a white guy. He had lightning to the front of his hair, which had been coloured in some way. And so, we need to find this guy. So it was, as I say, it was a really early and compelling lead, and it looked very promising.
And I mean, in fact, so much so that they went on to be looking for this guy for, hang on 1 minute, Satish, for almost 10 months, I believe, was the search for this guy who was the main suspect for this murder.
That's right, and I mean, even they had a suspect in mind who is a guy who's known as Mr. X, who had been a former client of Lynette's and was known to have a kind of like a criminal past that put him firmly in the spotlight of the police. And so they concentrated on this guy. He was under surveillance, and this was the guy.
Let me just correct that.
Yeah, come in, Satish.
Let me just correct that. There is absolutely no way that photo fit was up. What happened is they did investigate this photo fit very carefully, but they didn't find who it was. Later, somebody came forward and claimed that he was the person in it. But the problem with the photo fit, and it should have been fairly obvious from the start, is that the most likely time of the murder was during the night of the 13th to 14th of February, around about 2 o'clock in the morning. This guy was seen around 3:15 p.m. the following day. So what was he doing there? If it was the real murderer, why was he there over 12 hours afterwards?
Now, just to elaborate a little bit more, this wasn't just a straightforward killing of a street girl or of an individual. This was a very vicious and sadistic murder, right?
Absolutely, God, yeah.
It wasn't like two people having an argument and somebody got hurt.
No, this is what is now termed a sexually motivated homicide. There's really no doubt that that is what it is. And the end result of this is that if you look at that type of crime, it's committed by certain people. It's almost always one person, one male, acting on their own. There are very, very few examples of sexually motivated homicides committed by more than one person. And there's not a single one in all the annals of crime of 5 doing it. So that's what this case was about, or was basically brought to. It was a case that the investigation, once they couldn't find the guy in the photo fit, they had a backup. And that backup was always modified around that circle of people. And when I say that, I don't mean that they ran around in the same circle as each other. They didn't. What I mean is, it was the police had decided that the murder occurred in Butetown, and it was something that the people of Butetown, somebody in Butetown did it, and they went and put a lot of pressure on throughout the inquiry in order to get Butetown to crack, so to speak.
Satish,
it had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, your internet connection seems to be breaking up quite a bit. I'm not sure whether you want to try and find a way to strengthen that somehow, get yourself a new position. But you are cutting out a lot, and we're missing out on quite a lot of what you're saying. But going back, if I could just quickly get Kerry back in very quickly, so that we don't lose track of where we're going with this. Is prior to them going into the community, because I'm not quite there yet.
Right.
In the hunt.
I feel I can do it.
Sorry, Satish, we're losing you. We're going to need you to get a stronger signal, because we're not hearing you at the moment. But Kerry, are you there?
Yes, sure I am.
Okay.
Yeah.
So looking at how the police were going about this investigation, long before they went into the community during those 10 months, there was obviously a detailed campaign in trying to ascertain the individual whom they were projecting on Crime Watch and putting out worldwide or nationwide on the news, right? And all the evidence that they probably had in front of them would have supported the fact that it was a single individual that was responsible for the crime.
Yeah, indeed. And as I said, they had their sights set very much on this guy called Mr. X, and they had put a lot of effort into this. And basically, 10 months later, the blood tests came back, which basically ruled him out. You know, that he could not have been involved in this crime. So in effect, they were back at square one. And this was, as we say, this was a really vicious murder of a sex worker. They were under tremendous pressure to get somebody. And basically the inquiry then took an about turn, a very dramatic kind of about turn. And previously, whereas they've been saying all the time, we're looking for this one white guy, all of a sudden, breaking news, 5 black guys have been arrested.
Now, round about that time, Cardiff Bay Development Corporation had been brought in with X amount of millions of pounds to rejuvenate and regenerate the community and rebuild it, so to speak. And it has been suggested that due to the amount of investment that was expected by businesses wanting to come into the new development, external pressure was put on the police to quickly close this case. Otherwise, it would affect the investment coming into these developments. Was there any truth in that, or is that just a rumour still?
Well, I think that all I can say is many people that I've spoken to about this case all firmly believe that was the case. And whether that pressure was actually brought to bear deliberately or whether it was just an implied pressure, 10 months before this murder, there'd been a massive announcement to basically reclaim Cardiff's docklands and kind of make it into this world-class marina. There was a huge billions of pounds trying to be attracted to invest in the area. And of course, when you've got a murder of this nature and it doesn't look, it's no nearer to being cleared up, it's not a great incentive for investors to part with large sums of money. So I don't know whether there was an explicit pressure brought to bear on the police. But what I do know from the various people that were involved in the case, particularly some of the innocent guys that were subsequently charged with the murder, they're convinced that actually this was a big kind of influence on pressure on the police.
Here's the thing. So they spent 10 months looking for a white individual who had blood on his hands, sat down on the steps. And rightly so, the DNA proves that it wasn't him, and I get that. But all the evidence still points to one individual being responsible for the crime. And at that point, right, with pressure being brought to bear, with the investment being taking place in a community, so to speak, the police then went out and did what I refer to as the community invasion. They went into Butte Town and they arrested over 3,000, one by one or in different groups, and brought them into the police station and started whittling them down. Now, Satish, maybe if you've got a clearer internet signal, maybe you can talk us through how that process started and how it took place and in what order they started to bring them in on.
Well, it was the timing that you're presenting is slightly wrong. It was early in the stages that the pressure was put on, but it didn't need to be overt pressure. It was one of these things where that was, at the time, the most brutal murder of its type in Welsh history. You didn't need to tell them you've got to solve this. It was pretty obvious. So they would be looking for it, but as 8 weeks went by and weeks turned into months, the pressure would be increasing. And it was, but there were huge problems with this. One was their whole case hypothesis was wrong, and that they believed that this murder would be solved from within Butetown, and that if they put on enough pressure, they would get to the truth as they saw it from Butte. But this was a crime Butetown couldn't solve simply because it didn't know. It had nothing to do with the murder. The people in Butetown had nothing to do with it, and the people in Butetown didn't know who had committed it. In fact, nobody, bar the actual murderer, knew who had committed that crime. And we'll come back to that later, because he was a very, very difficult person to detect. It was something that required forensic science to catch up. And that was going to take the best part of 15 years. But in the meantime, the police looked at a number of leads. They asked for people to give blood for grouping purposes. And then later they asked for DNA. They were checking fingerprints. They were doing the whole works, and they were basically putting pressure on people to get to the truth. I mean, for example, Stephen Miller, it may not be that well known, was going around in Butetown asking everybody he knew, and also people he didn't know, if they knew anything about it, and telling them he had to find something to tell the police. That is a level of cooperation. You also have people like Yusuf Abdullahi and all the others, like the Acties, never had any time for the police, but this completely that all sort of dislike of each other were put on hold because nobody wanted somebody to have got away with this.
Do you know,
the problem was they didn't know and they couldn't.
I know the community very well because I lived in it, and I lived amongst them. There are, you know, I DJ'd. I started DJing in Cardiff in the late 70s. So 10, 15 years before this murder, I'd already become an integral part of the community, and the people in that particular area. And when you start looking at the different groups of people that they were pitching together, it didn't make any sense. Not to me, and not to anybody who lived there. It just didn't make any sense. These were not the kind of people that would walk down the road and have a conversation with one another. Some might know one's parents or another sibling in the family, whatever, but they just didn't. It didn't fit. Now, as the police started to bring in these groups into the police station, group by group, I'm trying to, me as an ordinary individual, is trying to work out how they managed to finalize the grouping that they had. Is there any particular theory? Is there any particular line of direction that they went to that they were able to tie these guys in? Is there anything from your research, for example, Satish, that you saw that allowed them to successfully connect these individuals so they can put them together into some form of a murdering gang?
Well, it was the pressure they put on various witnesses to say what they wanted. That was the evidence against them. There wasn't really anything else. The science was saying the complete opposite, that I mean, they began the inquiry looking for one person. That person turned out to be a man. They were looking for one man for the best part of the investigation. Then they abandoned that for no good reason. They never actually excluded the possibility that it was one person, and they just continued. So there actually was no credible evidence that these 5 men had committed that crime and committed it together. In fact, there was credible evidence pointing to the opposite conclusion, that only one person did do it.
But you know, when we look at this, it wasn't just the 5 men that were subjected to this police conspiracy theory, right? Because when you go into a community and arrest 3,000 people, that suggests you actually haven't got a clue who and what you're looking for.
Well, I don't know that you'd say they arrested them. They certainly went and talked to them, and they may have put pressure on them and told them they were going to arrest them, but they arrested 3,000 people.
I suppose that's a slight exaggeration from my point, but you know what I mean. They were all hauled into the police station.
Saying, if you don't give us something, we're going to... I'm sorry?
You're breaking up again, Satish. Your internet connection is very weak. I'm sorry. So we missed out on that. So maybe, Kerry, did you get an understanding?
Shall I disconnect, try again?
If you can, please. So yeah, Kerry, if maybe you can just fill us in a minute. Did you have any understanding as to how the police?
Okay, I'm doing that.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, Tony Paris, when I talked to Tony Paris, I asked him the same question, because they were just, there was this group of guys who never hung around with each other, who knew of each other in the area, as you have already said. But, the hypothesis was that they came together, like you say, in this murderous gang, and basically killed Lynette in what the police alleged was some kind of ritual killing over a drug debt. And I said to Tony Paris, well, how come, especially somebody like Tony Paris, who was known... He was a very non-violent person. He would shy away from confrontation. Tony, how come they put you five together? And basically his theory was that apart from Stephen Miller, and of course Stephen Miller was Lynette White's boyfriend, all the other guys came from big established docks families. And his theory is, and I have no idea whether this is true, it's only a theory, is that the police now thought, we've got these guys who are from big families in the docks. If somebody knows something, now they've got to talk, because these guys have been charged with this murder. So basically, that was his theory.
So now, Satish, are you back?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just rewind a little bit, because prior to Tony Paris actually getting involved, because he was one of the latter ones to be included into these into this conspiracy and these witnesses' statements. Because prior to Tony Paris, I believe, there was another guy by the name of Tony Parks, I believe, Satish.
I think it was Tony Brace.
Tony Brace, that's the one. I don't know why Tony Parks rings a bell. Maybe it was because he was a goalkeeper for Spurs. But Tony Brace...
Well, we won't hold that against you.
No, but Tony Brace was one of those that the police had already had in a statement as one of the suspects, or those that they were willing to charge with this murder, right?
Tony Brace was one of the people that was allegedly milling around 7 James Street on the night of the murder. I believe he was mentioned by Seiler and Vilde, and maybe a couple of the others as well. But he died in a motorway accident, and obviously that was the end of it as far as linking him or trying to do anything about it. And I know Tony Paris believes that it was simply a case of the name of Tony that they basically went for him, but I don't think that is the case. I think the most credible explanation I've ever heard as to why Tony Paris was included in this, and to explain it first, Tony Paris simply didn't fit in any way whatsoever. He didn't hang around with any of these people. He didn't have any record of violence, and it really was... Well, actually, he even fainted at the sight of blood, admittedly his own blood, but he fainted at the sight of it. So he just didn't fit. Within the community, people just were sort of saying, "You got to be joking. Tony Paris, no way." And the explanation I'd heard of it is that this was the final slap in the face of the Buttown community. It was basically saying, we can do anything. And they did. And that was the point of it. I mean, if you actually look at the evidence against Tony Paris in particular, he had an alibi, but the sole legal reason for his conviction was because he had to disregard the eyewitnesses, or rather than disregard them, you had to provide corroboration for them. The only legal corroboration for them was an armed robber and Supergrass who had actually been involved in another notorious miscarriage of justice before that. That's the quality of the evidence. They also made a total hash of the scientific evidence, because they said that Tony Paris expressed delight that forensics had messed up. Problem was, he couldn't possibly have known that information at that time anyway, because the report came on the very day that that particular informer left Cardiff prison, and that meant the last chance to talk to Tony Paris had gone. And that's before he actually could have had this information anyway.
Right. So, with that in mind, you've got Tony Paris, who's now being fitted into a crime that he obviously had nothing to do with. They've hauled in over 3,000 odd people from the local community, trying to whittle it down and get the information that they needed to put these people together. How did this conspiracy theory actually get to bear fruit?
Well, you have to bear in mind it began a lot earlier. The Cardiff Five, or if not the Cardiff Five, some people in that sort of community were always the backup plan. I don't know if you're aware of this, but in May of 1988, there was a management meeting of South Wales Police, which decided to view Yusuf Abdullah and Stephen Miller as possibly involved in the murder. There really was no credible evidence that they were, and quite a lot of credible evidence that they weren't. I mean, let's not forget, the late Yusuf Abdullah had a very, very, very strong alibi. There really is no doubt that on the night of the murder, he was working on a ship called the motor vessel Coral Sea, 8 miles away in Barry Dock. It's clearly obvious this is what he was doing. So you have to look at how they actually deal with this, because this is the other important point. You have two major issues here, and that is you have a strong alibi, and Abdullah is not the only one who had a reasonably good alibi, and you have a total lack of incriminating forensic science in circumstances where there is plenty of evidence, of scientific evidence within that flat. None of it is saying that these people were involved. So they have to come up with an outlandish hypothesis to explain away this inexplicable or seemingly inexplicable evidence. And what they do is disregard the evidence that they had previously.
Now, before you go any further, let us just dissect some of this evidence that they did actually had. That they had saliva, correct? They had blood. They had semen. They had fingerprints.
Yeah.
And they had fingerprints in the blood that was splattered on the wall.
I'm not sure about that, but they certainly had it. I believe what you're referring to is there was a palm print with specks of blood in between the palm print, so the palm had to have been on the wall during the murder.
Correct. So whoever's palm print that was, right, would have been leaning on the wall as they were conducting this vicious and ferocious attack, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yet all of this evidence that they had, the fingerprints, the blood, the semen, the saliva, etc., none of it belonged to any of the individuals that they had arrested and charged for this murder.
That's correct, but it's actually far worse than that. You have to bear in mind, this murder took place in darkness, without sort of street lighting or even lighting within the house, or the flat rather. So what they're essentially saying is you have the most vicious murder of its type at that time. We're talking over 50 stab wounds. You have blood all over the place. And somehow 5 men, and according to the prosecution case, at least 2 witnesses as well, commit this murder, have all this blood all over the place, and they don't leave so much as a bloodstained footprint on their way out. It's absolute lunacy. Especially when you actually look at it, there is plenty of evidence that one person did exit that flat and leave evidence of himself exiting. Scientific evidence. This was rediscovered by, it was the exit route of the murderer was reconstructed 14 and a bit years after the murder. And it was done through the forensic science. So they actually had plenty of evidence indicating it was one person and this was how he got out of the flat, and there was no way 5 men could have committed that crime. It's scientifically ludicrous.
But yet, this conspiracy theory that was knitted together eventually led to 3 of them, or 5 of them actually being charged and going on trial for murder.
Yes, but I think we have to be a little careful here, because while the police at that time bear a great deal of responsibility totally for the conduct of the investigation, you have to ask questions as to how the rest of the criminal justice system didn't look at this and say, you've got to be kidding. There's no way we can prosecute this. It's completely nonsense.
So before we go further into that, at what point should this investigation, had it landed on the desk of the Crown prosecution, who are responsible for making the decision as to whether a case goes to trial or not, what should they have been looking at?
They looked at the evidence, they looked at the statements in particular, and they decided to commit the case for trial, to a committal hearing, and it was then committed to trial. But what they should have done is use their own code for Crown prosecutors. At the time, they had 13 criteria which prosecutors were supposed to look for. That doesn't say if you don't find them all, you can't prosecute, but it's a guideline. And if you look at the guidelines and the terms that they were saying, this is what you should be looking for, 10 of the 13 were saying this is not an appropriate case to try. So if you're asking what they should have done, at that point, they should have said, we're not prosecuting this. Should have been discontinued. And that would have been the message that needed to be sent to South Wales Police at that time, because it would have been, the message would have been, we're not going to prosecute on evidence such as this. You can come back to us if you go and do some more work and you find some credible evidence. If it is good enough, we will then back you all the way and we will prosecute. What happened in this particular case, and what should have happened rather, is that the Crown Prosecution Service should have said, no, this evidence is not good enough, we're not going to prosecute. That would have then left a choice, and that choice would have been, do the police metaphorically stick 2 fingers up and say, we're going to, these are our suspects, we know they did it, we're going to go after them anyway, and they go and gather whatever evidence they can, however dubious that evidence is? Or do they do what subsequently happened, which is they look at this and say, well, if we cannot get the CPS to prosecute, we can't get convictions. If we can't get convictions, we can't be seen to be doing our job the way we want to do it. We have to change our methods. And in the end, the development of new scientific techniques, in particular a DNA testing system called SGM+, resulted in exactly that happening. The method of investigation began to change. You couldn't do what this case now. You'd never get away with it. There would be demands for DNA, and you wouldn't be able to explain it in the way that you would need to. Now, I'm going to come back to that later, because I'm going to have to kind of argue against myself, because they did actually try and look at this case and basically say later, this is the one time we're not going to listen to what the DNA says.
Now, Satish, in all of your research and in all the work that you've done, and I've worked very closely with you over the years, so I know just how detailed you were in all of this. In your conversations with the 5 and the 3 that was ultimately convicted, how confident were they during the initial trial that the truth will out, and they would be going home to their families?
I think they believed they were going to go home. I mean, if you actually look at the evidence, you look at that and you say, there's no way anybody can believe this. They got to acquit. So they were quite confident. I think that confidence somewhat ebbed away a bit because of in the first trial, when they basically saw they weren't allowed to use some of the evidence they should have done. For example, the very thing that collapses the collapses the case in the Court of Appeal was ruled inadmissible in the first trial, i.e. Miller's confession and the bullying.
Well, before we get to that, because I really want to go into Miller's confession when we get to the appeal, but one of the things that they did do was they moved the trial to Swansea, and the jury and the way that the trial was reported was reputed to have had a very detrimental effect on the outcome for the boys in particular, right?
It was an area that had a lower representation of black people that would have formed the jury pool than Cardiff or, say, Bristol. So if you look at this and say you are entitled to a jury of your peers, did they actually get that? And was it even possible they could get that in Swansea?
Let me drop in Kerry, because Kerry's been a bystander for a very long while. Are you there, Kerry?
Yeah, I am. Yep.
Okay, look, I want to get to the journalistic aspect of this, because one of the things that was identified by us as individuals and people in the community, back in those days, you had two newspapers in South Wales. You had the Western Mail and you had the South Wales Echo. Mm-hmm. The South Wales Echo was produced and distributed mid-afternoon. Mm-hmm. And the prosecution normally went first every day. Whether or not that had an outcome in what was reported in the newspaper, what I don't get was, what none of us got was how whatever the rebuttal might have been wasn't reported in the following day's paper. Because every day the afternoon paper would come out, it would only report on the prosecution's case against those that were being charged.
Okay. Well, I can't speak at the time that this trial was happening. I wasn't working in South Wales. I was doing my training in London, where I kind of stayed for the next 10 years. But all I'd say is, in terms of if you're going to be ethical in your reporting, which somewhere like the BBC, you have to, you're legally bound to do so, is you give as much prominence to the prosecution. You give as much prominence to the defence as you do the prosecution, and you are legally bound to report both of those. I have anecdotally, when I've been speaking to people, people feel very bitter about the way it was reported or the way it was treated by the press. I can't speak on that count because, as I say, I wasn't working in Cardiff then, and I haven't ever worked for either of those titles. But, you know, all I'm saying is, as journalists, you are duty bound to report both sides of those stories. And in terms of, even if you're going to be cynical and say, you know, the defence of the Cardiff Five, I mean, that in itself would have sold newspapers. So, I mean, it's incumbent on the journalists to kind of report that, because people were hanging on, you know, the every word of this trial. This was a sensational murder case. So, I can't see why they wouldn't have given the defence the prominence it deserved.
But that's very true in respect, Satish, that the reporting of the trial was completely one-sided.
It certainly came over that way.
Do you think that the way that the trial was reported had as detrimental effect on the lads as some people, observers, suspect?
On them, definitely. I mean, they would see reporting that was effectively biased, as they would see it, as it didn't really cover their case. And there was a lot of room for doubting the prosecution case. It should have told it. in far, far greater detail. I mean, if the job of media is to inform, you didn't do it.
Now, the prosecutor in that particular case came up for a lot of criticism. His opening statement, one of his opening statements, still rings loud in the ears of many who heard it. These guys carry knives like you carry handkerchiefs. There were terminologies that were used in order to paint a picture of these individuals that wasn't true to their character. Is that an acceptable argument?
I mean, certainly I quoted that he actually opened his prosecution by saying Butetown is a nocturnal, upside-down, topsy-turvy world where people carry knives part of their clothing. So he wasn't, in effect, just saying these 5 guys before you are like this. He was saying the entire community is like this. And it is worth bearing in mind a little bit of the context of Butetown. I mean, it was known, previously known around the world as the famous Tiger Bay. It's kind of the home of multiculturalism, a history which is, some would say, is not given the prominence that it deserves in Cardiff and throughout Wales. But this was an area that had kind of had that the capital city had always had a little bit of a difficult relationship with. It was the red light district. There was, as you were growing up in Cardiff, you were kind of like imbued with a sense of, you don't go down Bute Street because it's frightening. Do you know what I mean? So there was a kind of uneasy relationship with Butetown and the rest of the city. I think the young people of Butetown said they were discriminated against for jobs on account of their postcode. And so this all kind of was loaded up in a way that, and in his opening statement, he was basically saying, Butetown, everybody walks around carrying knives. So I think that was a point that was really, really hurt people. He did actually apologise for that on the final day of the trial after the guys had been sentenced. He did stand up and apologise for that. But I think it was it gave you the impression of perhaps what the attitude was to Butetown throughout the rest of the city.
Do you know the funny thing is, Kerry? I originate from London, and I went to Cardiff as a DJ in the 70s. I opened up my record shop on Corporation Street in Grangetown, and there was me and quite a few of the guys who were well-to-do or a bit more respectable, for example, who were quite frequent on the clubbing scene. But for majority of those that lived in Butetown, they couldn't cross that bridge and go into a club in town up until the late 80s.
Yeah.
They weren't.
That's interesting.
They weren't welcome in the towns. I can remember going into Flagstones, which used to be down by Lloyd's Bank, round the back there. And Flagstones didn't allow us. And in fact, well, it did. There were people like myself, Frankie Lynch, who was the European karate champion at the time, Winston Allen, who was a heavyweight boxer, myself, Bugsy, Jackson. There was a few of us that were allowed to go into the club. And I remember on one particular day when the bouncers had changed shifts and a new bouncer had come in, and he didn't actually recognize us. And I had my record shop supplying the DJ in Flagstones with music. I was barred from entry until I made them go and get the DJ to confirm that I was supplying him with music. Now, that was what they were used to. So, when you went into their world, when you came into Bute Street, when you came into Butetown, was it surprising that there'd be a bit of alienation, bearing in mind how they are treated if they try to step across the bridge?
Well, no, absolutely not. And that's under the bridge was a kind of like the unofficial gateway into Butetown that people would refer to. And I think that, obviously I didn't grow up in the community. From the research I've done, and there's a gentleman called Neil Sinclair who's written some superb books on the history of Tiger Bay.
I know Neil very well.
He's a great character, isn't he? But, it was an incredibly tight-knit community, primarily because the rest of the city would alienate it. So it found a kind of like, it found a brotherhood, if you like, amongst itself. So people felt incredibly safe when they were in Butetown.
But they alienated it until they wanted to go and be part of it. When they wanted to go out and have their nightlife, when they wanted to go out and be cool, then they came into the docks, because that's where the real nightlife took place. You had a club like the Casablanca, which was a very kind of Caribbean student type of environment. You had the North Star, which was over the other side, which is a totally different type of place altogether. You had all the pubs that were up and running and full of life, and obviously then you had the carnival, which would often take place on the park, on the field. So when people wanted to be cool and cool-like, they would come into the docks, so to speak. But they didn't like the docks to come out.
No, I think it's worth bearing in mind and looking a little bit back into the history of Cardiff, in that basically the history of Cardiff is its docklands, and before that, prior to that, it was just a series of mud flats with a couple of cottages in it. And I mean, you know, when those docklands started to rise, and they rise incredibly quickly, kind of Neil refers to it as kind of the Saudi Arabia of the UK. Then there was a kind of like a workforce came from the world over and settled in Tiger Bay. And so this kind of coalescence of people, Welsh women marrying men of colour, and you know, they were then ostracised because they were their families condemned them for doing so. And so this really, really strong community kind of forged the beginning of the inception of Cardiff, and then kind of the rest of the city spread out from there. So it seems a little ironic that the city then should look at Butetown and kind of, you know, not want anything to do with it, sort of thing, because it is the history of the capital city of Wales.
Do you know? So it was Cardiff, not so much the dock, but it was the home of Tiger Bay. It was the home of Shirley Bassey, Neil Kinnock. I interviewed Neil Kinnock back in the former Labour leader, and Neil Kinnock was one who regularly frequented the Casablanca in his days at Cardiff University. So
I didn't know that.
Well, it's also a place where Van Morrison, who once performed at the Coal Exchange just across the road from the Casablanca, used to frequent when he was in Cardiff. So it wasn't just a dingy dive that belonged to the local natives. This was also a place of real repute where people who travelled from afar, when they came to Cardiff, would want to find themselves, because that's where the life was, you know. So the picture being painted by the prosecution of what docks as a community was totally different to the community that I and others who travel from London and different places from across the country to venture into was welcomed in. It was the first place that I went to, more so than London. Cardiff was the first place, the docks was the first place where I could go to sleep and leave my car unlocked and my back door open with no fear whatsoever. The community was tighter than anything I'd ever witnessed anywhere else. It was the one thing that made me stay when I went, and many of us did. I wasn't the only one that went there and stayed back in the 70s. Many of us went there, and some of them are still there raising families today. So the community that was trying to be projected through the prosecution was one that was totally alien to those of us who'd come to visit and eventually ended up staying. But Satish, let me just flip over to Satish very quickly. In your research, because you came amongst us, and I remember walking down the streets of Butetown and the docks with you on many occasions where you wanted to go meet individuals or speak to individuals, etc. How did you find the community when you entered into it?
I found it to be a pretty open place, and that once they accepted you, you were fine there. You were never going to have any problem. They didn't need to close their doors effectively. I mean, nobody was going to rob from themselves. They might sort of go outside, but they weren't going to do anything in their own community, which is actually quite important in the context of how this case was investigated, because it happened in Butetown. It wasn't somebody from the Butetown community. They wouldn't be doing this on their own doorstep. And this is the key point with it, because one of the things that needs to be taken into account here is that community was effectively sentenced to death by this case.
Absolutely.
And it was executed. We supposedly do not have capital punishment in this country. We don't for individuals, but we did for that community.
And that trial and the conviction of those innocent individuals actually brought the community down to its lowest ebb. It tore families apart. It pitched people against each other, and it caused a lot of confusion and disbelief, even in those that had tried to remain hardcore to the cause, so to speak, because a lot of people believe in justice and in the procedure of justice. So some people will think, well, there can't be no smoke without fire. Did you evidence that in part of your research?
Oh yeah, there were a number of people. I mean, the irony of it is, even after Gafour was convicted, even after the forensic science absolutely categorically proved him guilty, there are still people who insist that somehow the Cardiff Five were involved and are guilty. They even go around saying that it came out during the police corruption trial that they had actually, that there were 2 attacks. This is complete nonsense. What happened with this is one of the QCs representing one of the police officers asked a forensic scientist a question, a very long-winded question, which was ending by asking if it was possible that there had been 2 attacks. The scientist says, technically, this is the equivalent of saying, if you're asking, can I rule out the possibility? No, I can't. But I also can't rule out the possibility that pigs could fly.
That's a weird statement. But here's the thing now. So, come towards the end of the trial with all the evidence that's been brought forward, and the way that it was presented, and again, just ripping back to the fact that it was only the prosecution's case that was reported in the local media. Now they've got to go and retire. The jury have got to go and retire and reach a verdict. Now, do you think the defense presented enough of a case that the jury should have returned a not guilty verdict?
Yes, there was plenty of evidence to say that the Cardiff Five, all 5 of them, were innocent. The problem is that a piece of evidence was included which effectively overruled everything else in the case. And that is just 6 minutes of the 18th interview of Stephen Miller, which is essentially saying 3 of them are in the room. Tony Paris was the one stabbing violently and in the belly area, which is actually quite interesting because the pathology report shows there weren't many wounds to the belly. So that actually is saying this wasn't true. So you have to ask the question, how did nobody actually notice that this crucial passage of interview was completely wrong? And if that had actually been pointed out, that the pathology evidence absolutely clearly shows Tony Paris could not have been stabbing her repeatedly in the belly because there weren't any, but there were very, very few injuries to the belly area. It was all concentrated higher up, which is why we're saying this is undoubtedly a sexually motivated homicide. So what they actually do with all of this is they basically hear this confession, they hear that part of it, and they forget everything else. And that's a problem. They should have been protected from that because somebody should have looked at this and said, well, hang on a minute, this is just complete nonsense. Now, this is not what happened, and it's demonstrably not what happened.
But in April 1990, the jury returns a guilty verdict on Miller, Paris, and Abdullahi.
It's November 1990, but yeah.
And but they clear John and Ronald Actie of murder. To the absolute horror of most people, and with no disrespect, none of them had anything to do with it. But the Actie family had a they were well known in the area. The 2 cousins didn't get on. There was battles in the dock, for example, and there seemed to be more aggression coming from them 2 than the other 3. So I suppose, in the light of the matter, you're asking yourself, if you were going to find anybody guilty, even though none of them were, right? How did they come to the equation that the Acties were cleared of murder, but Miller, Abdullahi, and Tony Paris were guilty?
As I just explained, it's all down to that 6 minutes of tape 18 of Stephen Miller. That says 3 of them are in the room, the 3 who are convicted, and the other 2 are not and weren't taking part in it. If you remember, and this is after they have reached the verdict on Miller. So this is at a time when legally they are not entitled to use Miller's confession against anyone. They come back and ask the question, can we convict of murder if we believe that person was in the room but not taking part in the murder? Well, the judge comes back and says he's surprised as to... the answer to that is no, but he is surprised that they're asking this question because he can't see where the evidence to justify that conclusion was. Well, he should have looked harder. It's in tape 18, the first 6 minutes, which the jury asked to hear again, and he allowed them to hear it. So how he doesn't know this is, raises a number of questions. And this is the explanation. That is why the actees were acquitted and the other 3 were convicted. And the problem is the jury placed an overwhelming reliance on Stephen Miller's confession. It never should have done. But also, Stephen Miller should have been protected, and he wasn't. His confession was absolute scientific nonsense. It was disproved by the forensic science they had already. You have to ask questions as to why Miller's defense never managed to get this done. They never challenged this, and they never looked at it. Why not?
Now, once they were convicted and they were found guilty, now I know I personally took part in 2 panoramas and 1 dispatch program leading up towards the appeal. But eventually, after 2 years, after 4 years in prison, 2 years on remand and 2 years of a sentence, this court comes to an appeal. And this trial comes to an appeal. The case comes to an appeal. The appeal case is heard. And again, Satish, I just take my hat off to you because I know just how much work you did in working behind the scenes in order to get some of that information available to Mr. Mansfield and Gareth Pierce. But
no, they did their own work. They found it themselves. I pointed them in some directions, and they did actually look at it, and it did help. But it was really them. They were the ones who found the evidence. Now
let's get to the appeal, because we in the lead up to this we talk a lot about Stephen Miller's confession, and during the appeal trial, that portion of tape was eventually played during during that appeal, right?
Yes, it was more tape 7 that was the key thing on it.
And I mean, because I know you was there. We were there together when we heard that, and I remember once that tape was played, we were sat down in the canteen of the appeal court, and we knew at that time that this has to be thrown out. The appeal was done. There was absolutely nowhere for the prosecution to continue with this. My question at this precise moment in time is, if that portion of tape could be so convincing during the appeal trial, why wasn't it convincing during the first trial?
Well, that's a very, very difficult question to answer. It is simply the only explanation you can give on it is Mr. Justice McNeil got it completely wrong. It
also,
was aggression.
If I can just interject there too, I mean, the whole point of the appeal court was that tape was played so people could hear it. Yeah. What had happened during the original trial was it was just a transcript, so you couldn't get the level of intimidation.
No, it wasn't. They did actually play the tape in the voir dire. In the legal argument, it was played. Yeah, There's really no excuse, because what is really strange about this is that Anthony Evans QC represented Stephen Miller in the first trial. He argued it properly. The pity of it all is that it fell on the deaf ears of Mr. Justice McNeil. If Justice Leonard had heard that, it is very likely he would have ruled differently.
So it wasn't played during the trial that Leonard presided over?
No, at that stage, Roger Frisbee had taken over from Anthony Evans because Evans was unavailable. And Frisbee took the decision not to argue that Miller had been oppressed. It was an appalling decision. And it's one that has ramifications throughout the criminal justice system. But it is understandable as well, because Frisbee would have looked at the original first trial and he'd have seen that they argued oppression and it didn't succeed. So he may well have thought, if I take the softer line of essentially saying it was unreliable and it caused his breakdown, but they weren't doing it deliberately, it would have the effect of getting it ruled out. It was a tactical blunder of gargantuan proportions.
The appeal was very short. In fact, I think, in all honesty, I think it lasted about 2.5 days. Because I think we stopped around lunchtime on a Wednesday. Was it 4 days?
It lasted 4 days, yeah.
Okay, it felt a lot shorter than that, believe me, because we travelled down every day on that, and so maybe my memory is slightly phased. But by the Wednesday afternoon, we knew that this was going to be over.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we've got to the point where the lads have been released because at that point they actually hadn't given a reason why they were going to be released, because we had to go back to court for that. So the appeal was won after 4 years of imprisonment, 2 years on remand and 2 years as a convicted on a life sentence.
Mm-hmm.
But the aftermath of that, because Tony Paris's father, for example, never got to witness his son cleared while he was alive.
Yes, that is one of the sad things about this.
And by the time the appeal was granted, the community was already being fragmented.
Yeah. It's one of these things that once you've said something, you can't unhear it.
Yeah.
And that is the problem. Once you throw enough mud, some of it's going to stick. And it still does. I mean, if you look at this and you sort of say, like, I was actually one of the people who was saying that there were a few people who were essentially saying, it's over, we've won, they're free, move on to the next case. And I was saying, no. This is why they keep getting away with it. Every time there is a miscarriage of justice, it's seen as the ultimate victory if you get them freed and you get a conviction quashed. It isn't. It actually leaves them in limbo, because the law essentially says, as it does at trial, you're not declared innocent if you are acquitted. You are told you are not guilty. And that means they haven't prove the case against you beyond doubt or beyond reasonable doubt. In the appeal, a conviction isn't, the quashing of a conviction isn't saying you are innocent. It does include innocent people, as does, of course, the acquittal of people at trial. But what it actually says is the conviction is unsafe. It used to say unsafe and unsatisfactory. But now it says a conviction is unsafe. It doesn't say, and by the way, this person is completely innocent and this is why. And if you actually look, you mentioned the point that it was a very quick appeal. Did you know it was originally listed for 3 weeks? Yes. And it was supposed to deal with a lot more evidence, which never came out. They didn't even finish Miller's appeal, let alone deal with Abdullah's and Paris's. And the end result of it is a lot of things that could have changed and law could have been advanced and developed as a result of that appeal, if it had been allowed to continue, did not happen.
In fact,
the end result of this is a lot of changes that should have made the miscarrying of justice at least harder didn't occur.
And in fact, yes, I am aware, because we did have that conversation. We were fully aware, as you know, I was aware of a lot of what would have come out had the appeal been allowed to carry on for its entirety. But it wasn't. It was ended after 4 days. The lads were released, and I remember having a getaway car ready for them and a party ready in Cardiff to bring them back to, which I had DJ'd well into the early hours of the morning. It was a great celebration. But now we're looking at the aftermath of what took place. which now opened the door to many questions. Because if they didn't do it, who did?
Exactly, and that was one of the major points. Because, as I said earlier, about, when you get a conviction quashed, it's half the job, it's not a complete job. It is necessary, if at all possible, to find the real perpetrator, because one, you don't want these people going around on the streets anyway, and two, nothing proves innocence better than that.
Now, Kerry, I'm sure you'd understand from a media point of view, three guys have now been released on appeal for a crime that's, the prosecution have tried to sell the country that they were guilty of. But you've now got a family, the family of the murdered Lynette White, who's left in limbo.
Sorry.
I think it's hard to imagine what the White family have been through in all this, and I have spoken to them. But basically, the police declare after the guys are freed and try and pick up the pieces of their lives, the police say that they're not going to reinvestigate the murder. So the implication is left in people's minds, well, like you say, they've been off on appeal, but was it a technicality? So, I think that creates a nest of vipers, really. And I know there was severe repercussions. I know there was an incident, I think it was in '96, where the area around John Actie's house was sealed off because Terry White, Lynette's embattled father, had turned up with a sawn-off shotgun and was knocking on John's door. Luckily, John happened to sort of see him out his kitchen window, and he didn't answer the door and called the police. But I just think, this family was tortured. They'd lost a beloved child, and whatever difficulties Lynette had in her life, which meant that she'd gone down the road of sex work as she had, there was absolutely no doubt that this girl was loved by quite a large family. So yeah, you can't begin to imagine the torture that they're living day in, day out.
And then when you add to the situation that the Lynette White family, because the one thing that I do know is that the community as a whole never once dismissed the Lynette White's family's desire for justice. It's just the direction that the police was pointing that was causing the problem. And everybody was aware that the Lynette White family deserved justice for Lynette White. But the boys themselves, coming home from this conviction, coming home from this life sentence that they were sentenced to, they also came back with a stigma, and so did their families, right, Satish?
Yes, they did.
And that was a battle in itself, trying to fight out of.
Well, the problem is that this particular, not the problem, but one of the major problems with this case is there's no shortage of victims. There's Lynette herself, her family. They've gone through absolute hell to actually over this particular case. It isn't just the murder of Lynette that they've gone through. It is every time there's something happens in the case, it's brought up again. And they were brought into a position where they believe that the police had done their job properly and that the system had done their job properly. And then all of a sudden, people who were supposed to be guilty of this were free. There wasn't any investigation to try to find the real perpetrator. They had to be forced, kicking and screaming, to do this. In the end, they actually did a fantastic job to find the real perpetrator, but then Lynette's family are left to fend for themselves. That never should have happened. The system should have gone to them and said, what help do you need? What can we do to put you back into the position you should have been if it hadn't been for the numerous and outrageous mistakes that our system has done? We owe you. That should have happened. It didn't. The same is true of the Cardiff Five. They should have had aftercare, not just compensation. They should have had aftercare. They should have been restored to the life that they would have had if this had not happened. And then there's their families as well. They didn't choose this particular thing. They had children who were basically robbed of their parents. And in some cases, the families were split by having, on the one hand, their father accused of these horrible crimes, and on the other, their mother doing some of the accusing. This happened. How do you rebuild the relationships after that? How does a child come to understand a situation like that? And having to deal with this for 15 years without the categoric proof that their father was completely and utterly innocent. Then you have the families, the campaigning side of this, where the brothers, Lloyd and Malik, had to make a terrible choice, and they made that choice to help their brothers. And that left their own families not getting the attention they should have had. Their children didn't make the choice. That choice was taken away from them. Now, we have, under the much maligned European Convention of Human Rights, a right to family life. Well, I would say that has been trodden underfoot, trampled even. It has no meaning whatsoever if we do not support these children, who were children at the time. They're now young adults, but they have had their lives ripped apart. That should never have happened. And then we also have the ones I will term the new Cardiff 3. These are the witnesses. It is a steaming disgrace that the only people who have paid a price for one of the most notorious and despicable miscarriages of justice in British history are witnesses who were bullied into saying what they said.
And there was very little sympathy for those witnesses, bearing in mind what their outpouring of evidence and statements, how it bore down on the community. They weren't integral parts of the docks community as such. They were known in the area to particular individuals and to one or two of the clubs and pubs in the area, but they weren't an integral part of that community that was invaded.
No, they weren't, but you have to understand the position they were put in. It wasn't like they chose to do this. They were basically forced. For 10 months, let's not forget, they made several statements. Not one of those statements was saying the Cardiff Five were involved in it. They told the truth as best they could. And they were effectively told, we're not believing you. We don't believe this. You're going to tell us what we want to hear, and then eventually they tell what they want to hear, and then they're boxed in. They're now put in a position where they cannot retract without risking perjury charges. Ironically, they are later prosecuted for perjury when they told the truth.
As a community, what the community couldn't understand is if these two were saying that they were there, why they weren't sat in the dock with the five that were originally charged and arrested.
Because they never wanted them as anything other than witnesses. They basically bullied them into saying just enough to justify the charges. But let's not forget, neither Leanne Hilde nor Angela Pasila wanted to do this. They weren't given a choice. And the end result of it is the people who took that choice away from them didn't pay as they did.
Some would some would actually argue that they were given a choice. The choice would have been to have continued telling the truth throughout, because those that they implicated with their very statements were not party to this. So,
but if I can just answer that, in Vilde's position in particular, she had a young child, and as you know yourself, she was actually threatened with either she goes on the boys' side and ends up in the dock with them, or she continues to say the truth as she knew it, and that's the sort of thing on it, or she goes on the police's side. She was basically threatened with having her child taken away from her. Now, most people in that situation, now a lot of people will say, I would never admit to something I didn't do, I would never bear false witness. Well, I'm sorry, I don't believe you. If you were put in the position that she was put in, 99.9% of people would do exactly what she did.
And in order to give some sort of substance to that argument, Stephen Miller's tape 7 in particular, explains just that, because I can't remember exactly how many times, but it was 84 times or so that he said no. And the one
303.
303. Well, there you go. 303 times he said no, but the one time he said yes, and he did say yes. He did say he did it, but it was after 303 times of saying that he hadn't done it, and all of those 17 hours or whatever it was of non-stop interrogation without a break that had worn him down and broken him down to eventually admitting that he actually did something that he hadn't done. I think it's very difficult for anybody to understand why anybody would admit to such a vicious and ugly crime if they hadn't done it. But that was also explained.
Because he didn't have a choice.
He didn't have a choice. And that was the whole difficulty of it all. And I think that's what a lot of people fail to understand, is the total immense pressure that these individuals were put under over a period of time that crushed them, crushed their very spirits, crushed their very souls, crushed their very reason for existence into subscribing and admitting to things that they actually wasn't involved in. Now,
yeah, that's absolutely right.
Lessons learned, Kerry. Lessons learned. Now that the appeal's out, all of a sudden now it's beginning to come to light now that there are practices that took place during this trial, during this investigation, that we as a people, as a nation, as a country, as a judiciary need to pay attention to. What was highlighted from a journalistic point of view?
Well, I spoke with the newly appointed Chief Constable of South Wales Police, and he openly admitted that this is something that continues to be part of the psyche of South Wales Police. And he basically said that as a result of this case, they feel that the lessons learned in terms of policing has really tightened up South Wales Police's record. But he did admit, he said it won't be for another generation that this case gives up haunting the police force.
And
so,
why?
There's that. No, sorry, go on.
I was going to ask Satish, why do you think it will haunt the police for this long, Satish?
Because it was so clearly preventable, and even after they found the real perpetrator, they refused to actually investigate what went wrong and do it properly. There needs to be a Truth and Justice Commission before we can move on from this. We actually need to find out, how did this go so terribly wrong, and what can we do to prevent it from happening again? Then we can move on, not before.
So go on, Kerry.
Yeah, I think there's also, just on the police corruption trial, collapsed due to disclosure issues. And I think disclosure, it's been in the news quite a lot recently into some high-profile rape cases. But I think that this was the first case really to highlight the difficulties and complexities around legal disclosure and the need to simplify that so it doesn't thwart as many trials as it does in future. And also, I think there's a point of lessons learned. It's something that Satish has been striving to highlight, which is basically that people that knowingly allow miscarriages of justice to go ahead when they are the actual perpetrator of the crime, they should be sentenced more harshly as a result of that. At the moment, it can be taken into account, but it's not statute that it has to be taken into account.
That's very true. But going back to the way that the police officers were tried, taking that back into, because I want to go back to that concept. How do you think the case against the police was dealt with?
How do I think?
Yeah, just from a journalistic point of view.
From a journalistic point of view, and from the kind of research that I've done, as I said, that the police corruption trial collapsed on issues of disclosure. And if you want, we can explain what that's about. It's quite a complex process. But it seemed to me that there was a lot of controversy around it, in that the Independent Police Complaints Commission had sanctioned South Wales Police to basically investigate its own officers. So there was numerous complaints about that. the guy, Chris Coots, who was put in charge of that investigation, there is no doubt that he led a very competent 6-year investigation of several officers, and which resulted in them being brought to court on corruption charges. Basically, it was those disclosure issues that led to that collapse, and that is a very complicated subject.
Do you think, Satish, do you think that there was a way around preventing that case from collapsing the way that it did?
Yes. Competent disclosure would have prevented it. And you have to ask questions about the whole thing, because they predicted that the defence tactic was going to be to attack disclosure and any failures in disclosure. So how did they get caught failing to disclose? It's one of these cases where absolutely everything could and should have been disclosed, and it wasn't. But I would actually go further and say you can see the roots of the collapse of this long before the disclosure issues did so. And that is the actual defence that the police officers were putting forward was scientifically ludicrous, and it is an affront to justice that it was actually put forward. It was basically saying, in this particular case, never mind what the DNA evidence is saying, Cardiff 5 are still guilty. First, they tried to say Gaffur and Cardiff 5 knew each other. You obviously have mentioned many, many times Cardiff 5 hardly hang around together anyway. So this was an absolute nonsense to say that Gaffur was somehow part of this non-existent circle. And then when they couldn't find any evidence to link them in that way, then they came up with this ludicrous idea that there had been 2 separate attacks. What you have to bear in mind is what they are saying is that in a legally privileged document, Gaffur tells his lawyers that he can only remember 12 stab wounds. He later says that again, but he says other things which are legally privileged. And this legal privilege, a coach and horses, was driven through it, and it was used as the basis of the defence because somebody in the taxation department decided to disclose that document of by John Charles Rees to the QC, to the taxation department. It was then disclosed to the phase 3 investigation, which was done deliberately because it would make it disclosable. That is how legal privilege was totally ridden over, and they basically were able to put these arguments. So they then say that because Gaffur can only remember inflicting 12 wounds, he came and did 12 wounds which weren't very serious. Lynette was still alive, according to this ludicrous hypothesis. And then he goes away or disappears from the scene. Cardiff 5 come along and they commit the nastiest parts of this murder. And then Gaffur comes along and moves the body afterwards. I mean, you have to be, well, I mean, it beggars belief that anybody could seriously argue this with a straight face.
Now, this cover-up was absolutely ridiculous beyond imagining. And I suppose anybody with any ounce of common sense would have been able to see straight through it. But the police were still allowed, in the community's eyes, in the public's eyes, to get away with a conspiracy to convict 5 innocent men, who 3 were eventually convicted of murder and sentenced to life for a crime that they didn't commit. And yet these officers' lives have almost been rewarded because most of them have reached their pension, right?
Well, with their acquittal, you can't keep the pension away from them. But I'd actually like to get away from this side of things because there is a major issue which has not been addressed. And that is right at the start, when Gaffur was convicted, there was a choice. That choice was, what do you want? Do you want revenge on the police officers who did this? Or do you want to find out what went wrong and prevent it from happening again, because you may not be able to get both. The sad thing is nobody even asked the question, which do you want more? And the end result was you actually got neither.
Yeah.
The police did not get convicted of this crime, and they didn't go of the perversion to, the conspiracy to pervert the course of justice and perjury, and you didn't get a public inquiry or any other real inquiry into what went wrong. Instead, you got 3 rather futile investigations, which were basically aimed, in my opinion, at taking the events away from the murder of Lynette White and the miscarriage of justice as far as they possibly could, so that they could eventually sweep the whole thing under the carpet. They must not be allowed to do that. And I think we also, at some point, maybe not right now, but we do need to talk about the tariff issue at some point as well.
We do. We've got about 10 minutes left on the show, so maybe we might have to revisit this on another occasion. But here we are. We're here now, and we're looking at 30 years since Lynette White's murder. And for me, it's a very sad story of miscarriage of justice is an understatement. Where do you see? And at this one, I'll throw this one to Kerry. Where do you see this going now as we approach the 30-year anniversary?
Well, from my point of view, I think that, as I said at the very start, this is the only point at which there's no legal proceedings pending, and I think that's always been not an excuse, but a reason maybe people haven't visited the story and it's fully. I think that now it's really important that this story is kind of like talked about, but also talked about in greater detail. And I think there's certain issues that's really important. Basically, fundamentally, is the human suffering that is caused when miscarriages of justice of this nature happen. But also there's lessons to be learned in the aftercare of when people are released from prison. Even people, I think Satish, you said this, like John Actie, Ronnie Actie is no longer with us. He died tragically young. But even people with John Actie, who isn't strictly regarded as a victim of miscarriage of justice, but has paid a very heavy price his entire life. What duty of care the authorities have for people like this to try and regain some semblance of normality in their life. I think it's really important to continue to highlight this story so that a younger generation continues to be informed about it. And basically, that lessons learned in the hope that this could never possibly happen again. Basically, it's important for the whole criminal justice system, but also informing a very younger generation of police officers who will operate with very different methods and very different mindset to how they have done in the past.
You know, this had we talk about John Actie as because because he was acquitted at the trial and found not guilty, but the Actie family is a huge family in the docks in particular, and I know them very well. But the impact that this trial had on the Actie family is untold. You cannot give them back the years, or the way that the family disintegrated because of this trial. The Paris family. I mean, Stephen Miller unfortunately came from London and had very little association or connection to those that were in Cardiff, apart from the fact that he had a few friends and Lynette was his girlfriend. But I would imagine the impact it was having on his family back in London would have been absolutely severe. The Abdullahi family, who again were a very tight-knit family, and all of this could have been seen in the evidence of the support that was given throughout the appeal, the protests and marches that went on, and the visits that were taking place to the prisons, etc., while they were waiting to be convicted. And then when they were convicted, John Actie's support for the 3 that were convicted is unprecedented. He attended every march, every demonstration. He didn't just walk off to one side and well, I'm all right, Jack. He was still living the Cardiff 3, Cardiff 5, so to speak, trial long after his acquittal. But the impact on the whole community as a whole is something that I believe you cannot repay. You can't restore that. You're never going to be able to patch that back up again, and prop this community back up to where it was, or the tight fitting connection and interconnections that it had prior to this horrific incident taking place back in 1988. Many writers and many producers, and John Williams came in and did a book called Bloody Valentine, which really tried to tear the community apart even more, in my opinion. Not everybody might agree with that, but I do. I was one of those that was interviewed for that book, and I was put into the book, and so was a few others that I know. But the way that book was portrayed and written didn't do the community any credit or justice whatsoever, and in fact possibly implicated them even more. But how that was sent out to the broader spectrum left a community dying, and I don't think it ever recovered from it. Is that how the media also sees it now, or?
Well, when you say the media, I can only really speak for myself, and you know, I think this is what the coverage that I did was certainly the most recent. You know, there'd been a long gap where there hadn't been any coverage. Yeah, talking to people like Neil Sinclair, this was the final nail in the coffin for that community. Do you know what I mean? It never recovered. There was only the kind of vestiges of it left at that stage anyway. A once really proud, magnificent, kind of unprecedented community. And it kind of finished it off.
You know, and at that point, clubs and pubs started to shut down, be closed down, be knocked down, and a community that was once a thriving community disappeared and has now been birthed into Cardiff Bay.
Indeed.
So what next, Kerry?
Okay, so what next? Well, I hope to, or at least my plan is to work with the guys, John and Tony in particular, and people like yourselves, people that were around the community at the time, to work on a podcast to tell the story basically from start to finish. So that's something that I'll be working on over the next few months, and hopefully the aim again to inform younger generation as well as people like of our age, you know what I mean, that think they know the case but they really don't.
Do you know, when you look at the miscarriages of justice as it used to be back then, and I'm sure you remember Satish quite well, because we had people like the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6, and there was a, you know, the M25-3, and there was a whole pile of miscarriages of justice around that time. Do you think that this case has done well in ending the plethora of miscarriages of justice that we had coming through at that time?
I think it wasn't allowed to. It was deliberate, in my opinion, that they made sure the full truth of this case never saw the light of day, or they tried very, very hard to make sure it didn't. Because if it did, people would actually see this wasn't just a normal or ordinary miscarriage of justice, it was an exceptional one. And I don't mean that in saying it's more important and worse than any other. Each of them are traumatic and appalling for people going through it and their families. What is unusual with this case isn't that things went wrong, it is that so much went wrong in the one case. You will see aspects of what happened in the Cardiff 5 case in virtually every single miscarriage of justice, but you won't see all of it in the one, like you did here. So in that sense, it's a unique case. It is also the first one where it was actually solved, partly because people wouldn't give up. It was put in such a way that they had to go and find the real perpetrator. If you look at all the other vindication cases, it has happened because there's been a cold case hit on the National DNA database, which has led to a case being reopened and finding the real perpetrator. The slight exception to that rule would be the Sean Hodgson one, because they actually had a very good idea who the perpetrator was and demanded that the DNA test was done on him afterwards, and it subsequently was. But in this particular case, they actually had to reopen the case, investigate it from scratch, and locate and find all the scientific evidence, which they finally were able to do. And it was very, very surprising that the real perpetrator wasn't on the National DNA Database, and later that he didn't even have a single criminal conviction to his name at all, nor have any psychiatric issues that were known about at the time of the murder. He was impossible to predict. And this is the key issue, because at the time, the police and others go into the Butetown community demanding they solve this crime. You couldn't. Nobody knew the characteristics of that murderer. And if you did know of them, you couldn't have found him. It required the development of the new DNA testing systems and a change in the attitude within South Wales Police in terms of that investigation. I'm not going to comment on all the others that they have looked on, but you have to give credit for the second phase of the Lynette White inquiry. It was a superb investigation that refused to give in the face of overwhelming odds. They could, and in many other cases, if you do not get a hit on the National DNA Database, that is the end of the story. In this particular case, it wasn't. And that is one of the major lessons that must be learned from these cases. If you do not get a hit, it doesn't mean that it's unsolvable. What it means is you have to look wider and with different methods. For example, familial DNA, which is what ended up helping to solve and identify Jeffrey Gathor as the likely murderer, and that was subsequently confirmed. If you had had the attitude of, we've looked at the National DNA Database, he isn't there, we don't know where he is, we've tried, sorry, we're moving on to other priorities, this would never have been solved. And if it hadn't been solved, you would still be listening to a thoroughly outrageous whispering campaign against clearly innocent people. That is unacceptable. And it is a measure of our society. If we are prepared to tolerate this, what does it say about us?
Absolutely. And, you know, I suppose sometimes we don't get to appreciate the work that people do behind the scenes to keep stories like this in the limelight, that justice can prevail. But again, I take my hat off to you, Satish and Kerry. I've not met you yet, but we've had a couple of conversations. But this has been something long in the making, long in the waiting. And I suppose there are still people who lived in the community back then who would love to see the complete truth come out of this and see justice eventually done, not just for the Cardiff Five, but for Lynette White's family as well. That maybe at some point the conspiracy that was led by the constabulary in particular, and a deliberate attempt to pervert the course of justice that led to innocent people being convicted for murder, that these people would one day be held to be accountable for their actions and their choices and the way they directed that investigation back then. But we've come to the end of this show. I really wish that we had more time, because there's so much more that we can go into, so much more that could be said about what took place almost 30 years ago in a tiny little street, St James Street in the docks in Butetown of Cardiff, where the life of a young girl was taken out, and the lives of many people were to be forever changed. I'd like to thank you both for joining us on this particular show. And maybe we just look forward to maybe updating this on another occasion. But thank you guys very much.
Sorry, Kervin, could I just add something? If people are interested in how this went wrong and what lessons can be learned, look at my latest book, Trials and Tribulations, Innocence Matters, because there is a trend, even in these vindication cases, where outrageous explanations of inconvenient forensic science are being used in order to try to prevent innocent people from proving their innocence, and this is having a dire consequence on a number of matters. So if you look at that, you will see how a number of these cases could be solved.
Thank you very much. Once again, Kerry Jackson, BBC Wales, journalist and reporter, and Satish Sekar, author and journalist. Thank you very much for your time on Issues Today, but we've run out of time.
World Jam Global Radio, this is Clarity. This is Clarity.
Just want to take this time very quickly just to thank those for being part of the show. We've really run out of time.
I already did my time. I paid for
This is Kervin, Julien, Issues Today on World Jam Global Radio saying I'm out of here.
Did my time. I paid for my crime.